I probably hold the world record for the most expensive fishing trip in history. It started with me casting a line off my own dock and ended with me owning a 40-acre lake, dismantling a corrupt HOA, and getting a very, very satisfying check with the HOA president's name on it. If you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping board member, you're going to love this. Stick around, because the story of how I legally body-slammed my entire homeowners association is absolutely wild. And hey, while you're here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see how far these stories of suburban warfare travel. It all began when my wife and I bought our dream home in a neighborhood called Evergreen Shores. It was one of those planned communities from the late 70s, now mature and beautiful, with tall trees and established gardens. The crown jewel, the feature that justified the slightly inflated property values, was the lake, a shimmering 40-acre body of water right in the middle of the development. Our house was one of about 30 homes that backed directly onto it. The sales pitch was all about the lifestyle: serene water views from your living room, peaceful walks along the community path, the gentle lapping of waves. For me, a civil engineer who spends his days dealing with concrete, steel, and logistical nightmares, the main draw was simpler. It was the fishing. The idea of waking up at dawn, grabbing my coffee and my favorite rod, and walking 50 feet to my own little dock was the suburban dream. For the first few months, it was exactly that. Pure bliss. I'd be out there as the mist burned off the water, casting for bass, enjoying the quiet solitude. It was my meditation, my escape. The other residents would wave as they did their morning jogs around the lake path. It was idyllic. Too idyllic, as it turns out. Paradise, I soon learned, had a serpent, and her name was Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president, a position she wielded not like a public trust, but like a feudal scepter. She was a woman in her late 50s who seemed permanently clenched, as if bracing for a confrontation. She was always milliseconds away from instigating herself. She drove a pristine white Lexus SUV, wore expensive-looking linen outfits that were always just a bit too tight, and had a haircut that looked like it cost a fortune to be that severe. Her preferred mode of communication was a condescending smile, followed by a thinly veiled command. Our first interaction was on a perfect Saturday morning. I was on my dock, just about to cast, when her voice sliced through the peaceful air. "Excuse me, you there?" I turned. She was standing on the community path, hands on her hips, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Her husband, a perpetually silent man named Gary, hovered a few feet behind her like a well-trained shadow. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep it friendly. "That is highly inappropriate," she declared, gesturing vaguely towards my fishing rod, as if it were a bazooka. I was genuinely confused. "I'm sorry?" "The fishing," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of exaggerated patience one uses on a difficult child. "Fishing is not permitted in the lake. It disturbs the aesthetic." I blinked. "The aesthetic?" "Yes. We have a very specific vision for Evergreen Shores. It's one of tranquil, natural beauty. Your hobby," she said the word like it was something you'd scrape off your shoe, "is disruptive. And it's dangerous for the decorative carp." Decorative carp. I had to physically restrain myself from laughing. I'd been a fisherman my whole life. I knew the fish in this lake were bass, bluegill, and catfish, standard North American freshwater species. The only thing decorative about them was how they'd look filleted and pan-fried, but I figured that wasn't the right thing to say. "Brenda, is it?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "I'm Mark. I live here." I pointed back at my house. "I've read the HOA covenants and bylaws cover to cover. There's nothing in there that prohibits fishing. I knew this for a fact." Before buying, I'd gone through the mountain of paperwork with an engineer's eye for detail, specifically looking for any rules that would impinge on my enjoyment of the lake. There were rules about boat motors, loud parties, and fence heights. Not a single word about fishing. Her condescending smile tightened into a brittle line. The rules were updated at the last quarterly meeting. A notice was sent out. "I see," I said. I must have missed that. Could you forward me a copy of the updated bylaws? I'd appreciate it. This was my professional mode kicking in. Document everything. Assume nothing. Stay polite. The fines will be in the mail, she snapped, her veneer of civility cracking. She then turned on her heel and marched off, dragging Gary in her wake. I stood there for a moment, rod in hand, feeling a sense of profound disbelief. This was how it started. Not with a neighborly chat, but with a dictatorial decree and the threat of fines over a non-existent rule. I sighed, the perfect morning now slightly soured, and cast my line into the water. A small act of defiance. I had no idea that simple cast would end up costing the HOA, and Brenda personally, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The first fine notice arrived 3 days later. It was for $250, citing Bylaw 17, Section C, Prohibition of Angling Activities. I pulled out my copy of the HOA documents again. There was no Section C in Bylaw 17. The entire bylaw was about trash can placement. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA president, this was fraud. And if there's one thing a civil engineer is good at, it's spotting a structural flaw. Brenda's little kingdom, I decided right then and there, had a very, very weak foundation, and I was about to start excavating. The second fine arrived a week after the first, then another. Brenda was a machine of manufactured outrage, churning out violation notices with a zealot's fervor. They were all for Bylaw 17, Section C. It became a running joke between my wife and me. Honey, did you remember to violate Bylaw 17 today? It was funny until the letters started coming from the HOA's management company, this time on official letterhead, threatening liens and legal action if the now cumulative sum of over $1,000 wasn't paid immediately. The humor began to fade, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. It was a targeted campaign of harassment. My weekends changed. Instead of relaxing on my dock, I was at my desk, my engineering mindset fully engaged. This was no longer about fishing. It was a project. The objective: dismantle Brenda's authority. The first step in any project is to understand the terrain. I didn't trust the welcome packet version of the HOA covenants she had referenced. I drove to the county records office and paid for a certified copy of the complete, filed and recorded master deed and bylaws for the Evergreen Shores development. I spent a Saturday with a highlighter and 2 stacks of paper, comparing the official version with the copy I was given at closing. They were identical. Bylaw 17 was, and had always been, about trash cans. Brenda hadn't just updated the rules. She had invented one whole cloth. This was a critical piece of information, but it felt like a single brick in a much larger wall I needed to map out. My investigation needed a new vector. I started taking walks around the neighborhood, deliberately timing them to when I'd see other people out. I struck up a conversation with an older gentleman I'd often seen tending his roses. His name was Arthur Henderson, and he'd lived in Evergreen Shores since the first houses went up in 1978. He was a treasure trove of historical knowledge. I told him about my predicament with Brenda and the fishing. He let out a dry chuckle. "Ah, Queen Brenda," he said, snipping a dead rose head with practiced ease. "She's been on a tear ever since they elected her. Thinks that title gives her diplomatic immunity. But you're right, son. People have been fishing in that lake for 40 years. My own grandkids learned to cast off that community dock." This was gold. I had a long-term witness. "So this rule is brand new?" I asked. "Rule?" he scoffed. "It's not a rule. It's a whim. Brenda decided last spring that fishermen were unsightly. Her word. Tried to pass it at a board meeting. It didn't get a single vote, not even from her cronies. They knew it was unenforceable and ridiculous. So, she just started pretending it passed. Most people just gave up rather than fight her. You're the first one on the lake who's told her to pound sand." He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "But if you really want to know about this place, you need to understand the man who built it. Old Man Fitzwilliam. He was a character. A stubborn, brilliant, land-rich developer who hated committees and bureaucracy. He set up the HOA because the county made him, but he did it his way. He pointed his pruning shears towards the lake. He always had a funny relationship with that lake, treated it like his personal property even after the houses were built. I remember him telling my wife once, clear as day, that the lake was his private retirement fund. Never did figure out what he meant by that. A private retirement fund. That phrase stuck in my head. It was an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit the official narrative of the lake being a common area. For a civil engineer who deals with property plats and deeds, that phrase was a blinking red light. Common areas don't belong to individuals. They belong to the collective, the HOA. If Fitzwilliam still thought of it as his, something was fundamentally wrong with the legal structure of the community. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words private retirement fund echoed in my mind. The next morning, I wasn't at the lake. I was back at the county building, but this time, I wasn't at the records counter. I was in the surveyor's office, pulling the original full-size plat maps for the entire Evergreen Shores subdivision. These weren't the simplified drawings you see in sales brochures. These were massive, linen-backed blueprints, covered in the elegant cursive of 1970s draftsmen. They detailed every property line, every utility easement, every right-of-way, down to the hundredth of a foot. I unrolled the master plat on a massive table. There it was, Evergreen Shores, in all its planned glory. I located my own lot. Then I started tracing the common areas. Lot C1 was the clubhouse and pool. I cross-referenced it with the deed records. Owned by Evergreen Shores Homeowners Association, Inc. Check. Lot C2, the tennis courts. Deed owned by the HOA. Check. Lot C3, the Greenbelt entrance. Owned by the HOA. Check. Then I got to the lake. On the plat, it was clearly labeled Parcel 7B. It was a massive, amoeba-shaped area in the center of the map. I went back to the digital deed records and punched in Parcel 7B. My heart started to beat a little faster. While all the other common areas had been formally deeded over to the HOA in 1978, the record for Parcel 7B was different. The search results came up. Current owner, Fitzwilliam Properties, LLC. A jolt went through me. I cross-referenced Fitzwilliam Properties, LLC, with the state's corporate registry. Status: administratively dissolved. 1998. Old man Fitzwilliam had died. His company had been wound down. But this one, single asset, the most valuable asset in the entire development, had never been liquidated or transferred. It was an orphan. Legally, the 40-acre lake in the middle of our neighborhood belonged to a ghost. The HOA had no more legal claim to it than I did. In fact, they had less. They had been collecting fees, making rules, and acting as landlords for a property they did not own for over 2 decades. And just as this beautiful, world-breaking realization was cementing in my mind, my phone buzzed. It was an email from my wife. The subject line was just 2 words. They did it. Attached was a photo of a legal summons taped to our front door. Brenda hadn't just threatened legal action. She'd actually filed a lawsuit. Staring at the photo of the lawsuit taped to my door, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The kind of calm you feel when your opponent has just made a catastrophic, game-ending blunder. Brenda, in her infinite arrogance, had moved the battle from the court of her opinion to an actual court of law. A domain governed by facts and evidence, not by linen outfits and condescending sneers. She had just handed me the exact weapon I needed. She thought she was cornering me, but she was actually walking, blindfolded and beaming with confidence, straight into a perfectly engineered trap. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of hyperbole and legal fiction. It accused me of flagrant and continuous disregard for community covenants, citing the non-existent Bylaw 17C. It claimed my reckless angling activities were causing irreparable harm to the delicate aquatic ecosystem, a phrase that surely made the basin catfish roll their tiny fish eyes. It demanded immediate payment of the accumulated fines, which had now ballooned to over $2,000, plus legal fees, plus a permanent injunction forbidding me from ever fishing, or even approaching the lake with fishing-related paraphernalia. Again, it was magnificently, beautifully, fatally flawed. My first call was to a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but the meanest, sharpest, most meticulous real estate and property litigation attorney I could find. His name was Daniel, and his online reviews read like a collection of horror stories from the people who had the misfortune of facing him in court. He was perfect. I booked a consultation. I didn't walk in with just a story. I walked in like I was presenting a project proposal to a major client. I had a thick binder, neatly organized with labeled tabs. Tab A, the certified copy of the HOA bylaws. Tab B, Brenda's violation notices, complete with the fabricated bylaw reference. Tab C, a sworn affidavit from my neighbor, Miss Henderson, testifying to 40 years of fishing on the lake. Tab D, the official county plat maps. And the crown jewel, Tab E, the certified deed for Parcel 7B, showing ownership by a defunct LLC, alongside the state record of that LLC's dissolution. Daniel, a man with tired eyes but an impeccably sharp suit, listened patiently at first, a look of professional boredom on his face. He probably got a dozen calls a week about petty HOA squabbles. But as I walked him through the binder, his demeanor shifted. He leaned forward, his eyes lost their fatigue, and gained a glint of predatory excitement. When I got to the deed for Parcel 7B, he took off his glasses, polished them slowly, and let out a low whistle. "Mr. Miller," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "this isn't a dispute. This is a public execution. I have never, in 25 years of practice, seen an HOA this monumentally incompetent. They've built their entire kingdom on quicksand." He picked up the lawsuit from his desk and looked at it with utter contempt. "They're suing you for trespassing on land they don't even own. It's glorious." His excitement was infectious. We immediately planned our counteroffensive. First, a formal response to their suit, flatly denying every claim on the basis that the HOA lacked legal standing. Second, a countersuit. This was Daniel's masterpiece. We weren't just going to ask for my legal fees to be covered. We were suing the HOA for harassment, for filing a frivolous lawsuit, and the part I loved most, for fraud. We demanded a full forensic accounting of the HOA's books and the repayment of every single dollar I had paid in dues that had been allocated to lake maintenance since I bought the house. Daniel explained that if they were using homeowner funds to maintain an asset they didn't own, it wasn't just mismanagement. It was potentially a criminal offense. But that was only half the plan. Defending and countersuing was reactive. I wanted to be proactive. I wanted to end this permanently. I looked at Daniel. "That lake," I said, "is an abandoned asset of a defunct corporation. Can I buy it?" Daniel's smile returned, wider this time. "It's complicated," he said. "It involves petitions to the court, notifying any potential heirs of the Fitzwilliam estate, dealing with state tax authorities. It's a procedural nightmare. It will take time and a not insignificant amount of money." He paused. "But yes, it's absolutely possible. And given that you're the only person on earth who seems to know it's for sale, you're unlikely to have any competing bids." The legal gears started turning. Daniel's office filed our response and countersuit, which was met with a scoffing dismissal from the HOA's lawyer, a slick, corporate type who was clearly just cashing Brenda's checks without doing an ounce of his own due diligence. Meanwhile, I engaged another part of Daniel's firm to begin the slow, arduous process of acquiring Parcel 7B. It felt like a covert operation. While Brenda was parading around the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that she was about to have me legally evicted, I was quietly navigating the labyrinthine state bureaucracy to buy the very ground beneath her feet. The process took months. There were notices published in obscure legal journals, searches for long-lost heirs of old man Fitzwilliam, none were found, and negotiations with the state over back taxes owed on the property. The final price tag, including all the legal work and back taxes, was about $30,000. It was a significant sum, but for 40 acres of private waterfront, it was the steal of the century. More importantly, it was the ultimate, undeniable checkmate. The day the sale was finalized, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I held in my hand a freshly recorded deed. The name on the owner line wasn't Fitzwilliam Properties, LLC, anymore. It was mine. The next day, we had a scheduled deposition meeting. Brenda, her lawyer, Daniel, and me. Brenda walked in with an air of insufferable triumph, giving me a smirk that said, "This is the day you get what you deserve." She had no idea how right she was. The deposition room had the sterile, tense atmosphere of a place where professional lives go to die. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Brenda, looking smug and important, flanked by her lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, a man whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide his profound laziness. On our side, there was me, dressed in a simple button-down shirt, and my lawyer, Daniel, who was arranging his files with the precision of a surgeon laying out his scalpels. Brenda was practically vibrating with anticipation, clearly eager to deliver her pre-rehearsed monologue about my reign of terror on her precious decorative carp. Caldwell started, his voice oozing a practiced, patronizing tone. He went through the timeline of my infractions, holding up Brenda's fabricated fine notices as if they were holy scripture. He spoke of the HOA's duty to preserve the character and value of the community. It was all I could do to maintain a neutral expression, feeling the certified deed in my briefcase like a hidden superpower. Brenda's testimony was even better. She painted herself as a beleaguered public servant, a lone guardian of decency against a rogue resident intent on turning their tranquil oasis into some kind of backwoods fishing camp. He was belligerent, she lied, looking directly at me with cold eyes. He showed no respect for the rules or the community. We gave him every opportunity to comply. This lawsuit was our last resort to protect the neighborhood. Daniel let her talk, occasionally nodding thoughtfully, letting her dig her own grave deeper and deeper with every self-important pronouncement. When it was finally his turn, he didn't lash out. He was calm, almost gentle. He picked up the lawsuit. "Mrs. Nicholson," he began, his voice soft, "this entire action is predicated on the HOA's authority to regulate activities on and around the lake, correct?" "Of course," Brenda said haughtily. "It is the central common area of our community. And as the central common area, the HOA owns it. Naturally," Daniel continued, still in that placid tone. "That is correct," Caldwell interjected, looking slightly impatient. "It is an appurtenance of the Evergreen Shores development, owned and managed by the association." Daniel nodded slowly. "I see. In that case, this should be very simple. As part of our discovery, we requested a copy of the ownership deed for parcel 7B, which I believe is the legal designation for the lake." He paused, looking from Caldwell to Brenda. "We have yet to receive it. Could you perhaps produce it for us now? I'm sure you have it readily available." A flicker of confusion crossed Caldwell's face. Brenda just looked annoyed, as if being asked for paperwork was beneath her. "I'm sure our management company has it on file," Caldwell said dismissively. "It's a standard document. I don't see the relevance." "Oh, it's relevant," Daniel said, his voice hardening ever so slightly. "It's the only thing that's relevant. You have filed a lawsuit seeking to restrict my client's access and behavior on a piece of property. The entire basis of your claim rests on your ownership of that property. So, I ask again, can you produce the deed?" Caldwell started to bluster, shuffling through his papers. "This is a procedural ambush. We weren't prepared to—" "You weren't prepared to prove you own the land you're suing my client over?" Daniel asked, his voice now dripping with theatrical disbelief. He let the question hang in the air for a moment, before turning to his own briefcase. "Well, perhaps I can help." He clicked open his briefcase and pulled out a single, crisp document. He slid it across the table. "This is the deed for parcel 7B, as recorded yesterday at the county courthouse. Perhaps you'd like to read the name of the current owner." Caldwell snatched the paper. Brenda leaned over his shoulder to read it. I watched as the color drained from her face. Her jaw went slack. The smugness, the confidence, the entire facade of regal authority she had built for herself evaporated in an instant, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. Caldwell's eyes darted back and forth over the page, as if he could will the words to change. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "As you can see," he said, his voice now like ice, "the Evergreen Shores OA does not, and has never, owned that lake. For 20 years, you have been fraudulently collecting fees for its maintenance and enforcing rules on property that did not belong to you. And as of 3:15 p.m. yesterday, that property belongs to my client." He pointed at me. "So, not only is your lawsuit entirely without merit, but you, Mrs. Nicholson, and the entire HOA board have been fining and harassing a man for fishing in what is now, legally and indisputably, his own private lake." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the beautiful, perfect silence of total victory. Caldwell just stared at the paper. Brenda looked like she might faint. Daniel wasn't done. He then presented the paperwork for our countersuit, detailing the harassment, the frivolous litigation, and the fraud. The case was over. They knew it. Their lawsuit was dropped the next day. A month later, a judge ruled entirely in our favor on the countersuit, ordering the HOA to pay back every cent I'd paid toward lake maintenance, cover all of my substantial legal fees, and pay an additional punitive damage award for the harassment. But the real revenge wasn't the money. The real revenge came the following Saturday. At 7 a.m., a truck from a local fencing company pulled up. Over the next 8 hours, they installed a tasteful but very, very clear 6-foot chain-link fence. It ran along my new property line, which happened to be the entire shoreline of the lake. I had them install it a foot back from the water's edge, creating a perimeter around the entire 40 acres. The community walking path, the benches with the memorial plaques, the charming little gazebo, and the community boat dock were now all on the wrong side of the fence, cut off from the water they were built to enjoy. Every 20 feet, I had them hang a sign. A simple, professionally printed sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." The fallout was immediate and spectacular. My phone started ringing off the hook. Panicked neighbors, furious neighbors, confused neighbors. The idyllic lakeside views they'd all paid a premium for were now views of a fence. The community's crown jewel had been cordoned off. Brenda's little kingdom had lost its castle. An emergency HOA meeting was called that weekend. I didn't attend, but I heard it was a bloodbath. Residents who had previously been too intimidated to speak up were now openly screaming at Brenda, waving pictures of the fence, demanding to know how she could have let this happen. Confronted with the undeniable proof of her incompetence and lies the fact that she'd sued a man over a lake, the HOA never even owned her authority, crumbled to dust. She and the entire sycophantic board were forced to resign in disgrace. A week later, a delegation from the newly elected, shell-shocked HOA board knocked on my door. It was a very different kind of visit from my first encounter with Brenda. They were humble. They were apologetic. They were desperate. Mr. Miller, their new president, a reasonable-looking woman named Susan, began. We understand we're in a difficult position, one of our own making. We're here to ask what, if anything, we can do to restore access to the lake for the residents." I invited them in. I had been waiting for this. I wasn't a tyrant. I didn't want to be the villain of the neighborhood. I just wanted to be left alone to fish. I had my lawyer draft a formal access agreement. It was a simple, fair contract. The HOA would pay me a modest annual licensing fee in amount. That was, ironically, about 30% less than what they had been budgeting for lake maintenance under Brenda's fraudulent regime. This fee would cover the property taxes and basic liability insurance. In exchange, I would take down the fence and grant all residents of Evergreen Shores a permanent easement for passive recreation, walking on the path, sitting on the benches, and launching non-motorized boats from the community dock. They eagerly agreed to everything. The contract was signed the next day. The fence came down that weekend. But I had my lawyer add one final clause. a clause that was designated as permanent, non-negotiable, and unable to be amended by any future HOA board without my express written consent. Clause 9. F. Notwithstanding any other community rule or bylaw, past, present, or future, recreational catch and release fishing by all residents and their accompanied guests shall be permitted from the shoreline and non-motorized watercraft at all times. The story ends where it began, on my dock, on a quiet morning, with a coffee in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. The lake is peaceful again. The neighbors are friendly. The new HOA board leaves me completely alone. Every now and then, I'll see a father and his kid casting a line from the community dock, and I'll smile. Brenda and her husband moved away a few months after the debacle. Rumor has it they had to sell their house at a loss. Turns out a lakeside home without lake access isn't quite as valuable. Sometimes, when I'm out there in the morning mist, I think about her, and I think about her precious decorative carp, and I have to admit, for a decorative fish, they put up a pretty good fight. And taste even better. Thanks for sticking around for the whole story. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because you never know when the next suburban war is going to break out.